All right, everybody, welcome to another edition of the Leadership Blend TV show with your gracious host, Ricardo D. Rice. And welcome to episode 9. Yes, episode 9. It seems like yesterday when I first started this show, but I'm so grateful that you decided to tune in yet again to hopefully retain this great information that I'm giving you. All right, so on last week we talked about social media, which is usually the elephant in the room because most people don't like to talk about social media because I think a lot of people still feel like social media is not a necessity to make your organization great. And most of the time we're talking about churches and ministries, and although God is great and He is good, you still have to have a basic understanding of how to expand your organization and hopefully better your programs and your services. And social media can be the most inexpensive way by which to do that. So on last week, I covered the 4 more important outlets of social media, which are Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. So I want to do a quick recap of each one. So let's start with Facebook. Facebook is, like I said, your more older social media outlet, so mostly any generation can understand how to utilize Facebook. But Facebook is good because it brings you around to so many different people, so many different types of organizations, and so many different outlets that you can utilize to expand your programs and your services. So with Facebook, there are things that you want to remember, like your videos do not have to be 30 minutes or a minute. They can be as long as you like for them to be. But again, I always advise people, remember, the longer your video, the less attention you're going to have because most people have a short attention span. So case in point for myself, I use my Facebook to do my live streaming when I'm in the studio doing my radio show. Well, my radio show is 2 hours long. So I don't try people's patience with a 2 hour long Facebook Live. What I do is I do the Facebook Live, those that can tune in, and once it's over with, I cut it up and make little 30-second commercials by which to get people's attention. So you want to think about things like that because again, people's attention span is rather short. So the shorter your video, the more you can get into a 30-second or a minute video, probably the better your chances of retaining people's attention and having them retain your information. Also with Facebook, you can do photos, you can do your lives, of course. You can also do some other little things. Create a community. So you can create a community on Facebook, get people, that's usually what people see when a friend of yours will say, well, hey, I want you to join the ministry dance group. Those are kind of communities. And in those communities, you can regulate, you can interact, you can share what your organization is doing, you can share what your ministries is doing. So you definitely want to keep in mind about the community. So you have your photos, you have your communities, and you have your lives. Next, you have Instagram. I always tell people Instagram is more of the visual part of social media. So on Instagram, you want to put your flyers. You can do little videos on Instagram, but they can be no longer than a minute. So you want to keep that in mind whenever you do your Instagram. So with my Instagram, I put my flyers on it. I will do my commercials because they're only like 30 seconds to a minute anyway. They are perfect for Instagram. And Instagram has also started doing IGTV. IGTV is still new. I don't really think it took off like people thought it was going to take off, primarily because you can only do the camera vertically, not horizontally. So that means you're limited to maybe 1 or 2 people in the frame versus 3 or 4 people. Now for ministries, that is an issue because let's say you're trying to do a video for your dance group. That's going to be hard because you have to keep the camera vertical. So you want to keep that in mind when you're thinking about doing IGTV. I typically only do IGTV if I'm doing the TV stuff, not the radio stuff, because of the radio I have correspondence. So I have to keep that in mind when I'm trying to do IGTV. Also, IG also has your story. So in your story, which I'm still playing around with, so still a little new to me as well, but I'm definitely finding that in the stories, it's like a little quick excerpt of what you're doing. So I start using my stories when I upload new episodes to my YouTube channel. I'll take a picture of it, circle it, like, hey, you guys, there's a new episode on my YouTube channel. And I also do the same thing on Facebook. So you want to keep that in mind. So your story is like a little synopsis of what you're doing, maybe a photo, and you can add music to it and little funny pictures and all that good stuff. And people can click on it. It does it for about 30 seconds. You can move on to something else. Remember, the key to all social media is keeping it short, sweet, and clean. So remember that. Short, sweet, and clean. Next, you have Twitter. Now remember, I only typically use Twitter when I'm trying to build relationships or when I'm trying to reach out to a company. And I always use the example of when I took a picture of me and my nephew and I had on an Express outfit. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to play around with it and tag them and see if I get a response. Well, I did. I took the picture and I made some comment about, hey, I think I look kind of cute in Express. I wonder if they'll sponsor me. I tagged them in it on Twitter. They actually immediately responded and made some quirky little comment like, yeah, we think you are. You should contact our sponsorship department. So I always tell people Twitter is really good to get directly to a certain department of an organization. and they also allow you to do other little things. So with Twitter, you can also do a live video as well, and I think that video is as long as you want it to be. But for smaller videos, like 30 seconds is what you want to do for Twitter. You can also put up media, so you can put up your flyers and everything on Twitter. So you can do all that stuff. So it's kind of a pattern. You can do a lot of this stuff across the board. A lot of them just limit certain things. So videos, again, with Instagram is only 30 seconds to a minute. Twitter, I want to say is 30 seconds to a minute. So you want to keep those things in mind. Lastly, you have LinkedIn. Let me stress this again for my pastors in ministry. LinkedIn is still a very powerful tool for your church or your organization. Why? Because with LinkedIn, it's more of the professional Facebook. So this is where you can create relationships with people in a hierarchy, or you can create relationships with partnerships that you want to encourage. Case in point, I think a couple of weeks ago I used the example about a church trying to partner up with a doctor's office to do screenings. So in that scenario, you can always think about your local doctor's office, go into the search box on LinkedIn, type in the name of that organization, and it'll give you the names of people that are registered on LinkedIn in that organization. And then you're able to send them a personal message and say, well, hey, my church is trying to do X, Y, Z. We know that you're the nearest hospital. We were looking to get in contact with somebody that handles your community outreach. Just that fast, you were able to bypass going to a hospital, walking around the hospital, figuring out who's in charge. LinkedIn is a very valuable tool for things like that. And it's also good for your ministry. So let's say the pastors or leaders in your ministry are trying to do certain things. They can say they're affiliated with your church, and people are be able to get in touch with you on that level as well. So you want to keep all these things in mind. So again, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn are probably your four main outlets by which to get things done and to help you expand your programs and your services for your church, ministry, or organization. All right, everybody, so we've done a lot of talking, we've done a lot of looking at things, but I haven't gone over the different types of organizations that you could create, or the different types of companies that you could create. Now, again, when we talk about churches and ministry, typically you guys do fall under the nonprofit sector, so that's typically where you want to stay. But then I remember speaking out last week when I was saying about pastors and creating LLCs or limited liability companies, and some people asked for some clarity on those things. So for that reason, we're going to talk about the different types of organizations that you could create. All right, so the first one is a sole proprietorship, and the name kind of implies exactly what it is, that one person is the proprietor of the organization. So I'm going to give you a synopsis, but I'm going to give you the actual definition as well. So a sole proprietorship is an unincorporated business run by an individual who is personally liable for any financial debts. So remember that. People love to be a dictatorship, meaning one person is in charge. But also remember, when it comes to an organization, when the liability falls, that's who's going to fall on. So if you choose to start a sole proprietorship, all the liability is going to fall on you. So it doesn't matter, who's with you or who's doing things with you. It's about what's on the government paperwork that you submitted when you created your organization or your company. So again, if you create a sole proprietorship, remember that all the liability is going to fall on you. And that sounds cute in theory until something happens. And then when something happens and people come after you personally for your assets or your organization, these are the kinds of things you want to keep in mind if you decide to be the only person in charge. Okay? Second one, a general partnership. And a general partnership is similar to a sole proprietorship, but it's between two or more individuals. So with a general partnership, it's just like the name implies, a partnership, more than one person. You have a partner so that you guys will share in the liability. Again, this is the aspect you want to think about when you create your company or your organization. Who's going to share in the liability? Because things will happen with the organization or a company. So you want to think about that when you think about creating your organization. Are you going to be the only one that carries the brunt of your liability? Or do you want to share that liability with other individuals so that you all will be on the line? So remember that. And then the most popular one, an LLC. For those that do not know, an LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. And that allows for owners in the owners of these companies are limited in personal liability, do not have stock, and they enjoy a pass-through taxation like a partnership. Most people do an LLC because the name implies exactly what it is. It's a limited liability company. meaning that the liability that you're responsible for is very limited versus having a regular company or a regular company where the accountability goes across the board. So you want to think about that when you create a company. Plus, they're a little easier to do versus some of the other ones that I've gone over or are going to go over. So you want to keep that in mind. So we've gone over a sole proprietorship, a general partnership, and an LLC or limited liability company. And there's also 3 others that I'm going to kind of go over but not really get into because, again, people typically do gravitate more towards limited liability companies. And I will get more into that a little later on. So right now it's just kind of like a general overview. So the other one is a C Corp. And that's a company whose owners own shares of stock and are subject to double taxation. Another one, the next one is a S Corp, or a corporation that qualifies to avoid double taxation. And then the last one is a LLP, or a limited liability partnership, and it is a business partnership in which one or more partners have limited liability. All right, so you want to remember these things. So sole proprietorship, I think in my head I think of it like a dictatorship where one person is in charge, but that one person is also liable if something happens within the company or the organization. The next one is a general partnership, or think about having partners where not just one person is carrying the brunt of the liability should something happen. And again, I cannot stress this enough, things will happen. Case in point, remember with your ministry, especially to my holiness and my apostolic churches, when we're shouting and we're dancing and somebody falls or they get hurt and they decide to sue the ministry, these are the kinds of things you have to think about, because those things will happen. And people, we're all saying that we love Jesus, but people are human and people will do things. And I've seen it happen. People got sued. They created a company thinking it was going to be one thing, discovered it was something completely different, and the liability fell on the person that was in charge. So you want to remember that. Another sidebar is, remember, whoever is the incorporator, when you fill out your organizational paperwork for the government, that's the person that's going to be held liable. So it doesn't matter that 15 of you guys were in the board meetings. If only Joe Blow name was signed as incorporated for that organization, he's the one that's going to be in trouble when it comes down to liability for your organization. So always remember to get things in writing. And if you need to change some things, always remember to get an amendment to change what was already in your contract. That was free. I just want to throw that out there. All right, LLC, limited liability company. Again, remember, it allows owners limited personal liability and doesn't have stock and enjoys pass-through taxation like a partnership. Also on a sidebar, remember, and I'll get into this a little bit later on, remember there are different types of tax codes for all these different organizations. I know it sounds very complicated, very convoluted, but I assure you I will go over it at a later date or maybe later in this video. All right, C Corp, a company whose owners own shares of stock and are subject to double taxation. S Corp, a corporation that qualifies to avoid double taxation. And an LLP, or a limited liability partnership, is a business partnership in which one or more partners have limited liability. All right, so you want to remember all these things because they are very important when you go to do your government paperwork. And at the end of the day, that's what it really boils down to. What did you submit to the government when you created your organization or when you created your company or / your church or ministry? Alright, so we just finished going over the different types of organizations that you would create and the government paperwork that kind of goes along with it. It puts you in a headspace. Alright, so I know I use a lot of terminology, and actually we use a lot of terminology oftentimes that we're not familiar with. So this little section I'm going to do is kind of breaking down some of the terms you're going to hear as I continue on, because they're kind of important terms. Okay? So the first one is the Articles of Incorporation, because I know we hear this all the time. People say, well, I should have my Articles of Incorporation. I don't really know what that is. So I'm going to tell you what that is. All right? So the Articles of Incorporation are rules to be filed with state identifying information about a corporation, such as the name, address, purpose, and number of shares. Now, for you nonprofits or churches or ministries, you won't have number of shares because you are a nonprofit, and legally you cannot distribute your earnings to shareholders or investors or anything of that magnitude under a nonprofit, especially 501c3. But in your Articles of Incorporation, you will definitely still have the name of your organization, the address of your organization, and the purpose. Those will definitely go into your Articles of Incorporation. Now, I think I did Articles of Incorporation in episode 2 or 3, so you definitely want to go back and revisit that because it'll tell you everything that's actually supposed to be in it. That was just kind of a run through. All right? Your next one, Articles of Organization. And these are rules to be filed within the state to identify information about an LLC, detailing the company information and management. So hopefully you caught the difference. Articles of incorporation are for a corporation. Articles of organization are for LLC, which we learned LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. So if that's what you're trying to start, then you will need articles of organization, not articles of incorporation. So everybody caught that. Really quickly again, remember, articles of incorporation are for a corporation or trying to be incorporated. Articles of organization are for a LLC, which are limited liability company. So you might want to make sure you have that difference in your head. All right, moving right along. Bylaws. Bylaws are laws that provide the internal operating procedures for the governance of a corporation. So basically, it says, the name implies what it is, bylaws. These are the laws that are supposed to be enforced within your organization. And I always tell people, with your bylaws, make sure that you include things such as a fail-safe. What is a fail-safe? Case in point, with the government and us having a president, and us having Congress and the Senate and all that stuff, the Constitution provides fail-safes, so if things happen, we can refer back to those things and say, okay, well, in the case of which we had the government shutdown, there was a fail-safe that gives the president the authority to call a state of emergency. In that case, there's a whole other set of rules that have been created for that scenario. You want to keep that in mind when you're creating your bylaws. Now, let's say there's a standoff, especially for organizations that have to elect officials. Let's say there's a standoff. You want to have in your bylaws a fail-safe that says, in case of a standoff or in case of a draw, this is what you do to determine who actually wins that particular office or that particular seat. So you definitely want to think about stuff like that when you're creating your bylaws. Or what happens in the absence of someone dying. Let's say the pastor dies in your organization. Who steps up next? What if you don't have an assistant pastor? Who takes over the reins of the ministry? These are the kinds of things you want to remember when you're creating your bylaws for your organization, because these things will happen. The worst thing you want to happen is somebody die in the office, the bylaws do not give a fail-safe, and it becomes a free-fall as to who takes over your ministry or your church, because these things will happen. Whenever you're creating your articles of incorporation or your articles of organization or your bylaws, always keep in the back of your head that life happens, and as a result, things will happen. And the more fail-safes you have in place, the better the chances of survival for your organization. All right? The next one, DBA. You will hear this a lot. You will see this a lot when you're signing contracts. And DBA means doing business as. So let's say your pastor is out representing the ministry and your church's name is House of Abundance. And the pastor is Bishop Greenleaf. And he goes to go sign a contract. In that contract, it's going to say Pastor Greenleaf, DBA as Abundant Life Ministries. I'm assuming that's the name I gave. Anyway. So that means that he's signing on behalf of the church. So if something goes wrong, he becomes liable, but the church will be liable as well because he has been empowered to sign a contract as the person of interest. So you want to think about stuff like that. Whenever you're sending agents out into the field and they're signing contracts, be mindful, especially if they sign a contract DBA or doing business as, or think about it this way, doing business on behalf of an organization. So that was a little tidbit I want to throw out there. Whenever you're signing a contract, it's going to say that. DBA, doing business as. All right? And the last go around, I used a term that said double taxation. So here's the definition of double taxation. Tax on both the profits of a corporation and the dividends paid to shareholders. Now again, that does gear more to for-profits, because in a nonprofit, legally, you cannot provide revenue or divide revenue up between your shareholders or investors, because you can't have those things in a nonprofit. But in a for-profit, you want to be mindful of that, about double taxation and how that's taxed on the profits of a corporation and the dividends paid to your shareholders. All right? Next, we have the EIN. And the EIN, which I think I went over in episode 2 or 3, your EIN is your employee identification number, and is used to track the employee payments obtained by filing IRS Form SS4. So again, your EIN number is when you have employees and you're paying them. This is how you track them. This is the number you give every employee that's on your payroll, so that you can keep track of the payments you give them, how much they were paid, when they were paid, all of that good stuff. And you will definitely have to file that or get that number whenever you file your paperwork, be it a for-profit or a non-for-profit. So that goes across the board. So remember, there are certain terms that I use that may be limited to a for-profit, but there are also other terms that I will say will be used across the board, and an EIN number is used across the board. All right? Operating agreement. Your operating agreement is the details of your ownership, distribution payment, and members' responsibilities and rights. I'm not going to really get into that one because I have two more I need to get to in this segment. So the next one is pass-through taxation. Is the taxes of a business are passed through to the owner, unlike double taxation of corporations. And then the last one is kind of like cliche-like wording. Piercing the corporate veil is a legal decision in which a corporation is no longer treated as a separate legal person. So again, these are just terms of vocabulary that you just want to be mindful of, and hey, you want to keep them in the back of your mind in your vocabulary because these are very important words that you will use on the day-to-day operations of your organization. Okay, so we went over a lot of details and a lot of information, and hopefully you retain most of it. Just remember that one of the more popular types of organization that is constantly created is the limited liability company, because for all intents and purposes, the name implies exactly what it does. It gives you limited liability. And at the end of the day, it's a liabilities game. If somebody falls in my ministry and gets hurt and they sue the church, who's going to be on the line? Who's going to be liable for whatever they sue for? So always think about that in your head, because I think a lot of times, especially in ministry, we don't think about those kinds of things. And then when it happens, we're caught off guard because we joke about it. But there are a lot of people sitting up in courtrooms. There are a lot of full dockets now from people being sued by members of their ministries or people that slip and fall in grocery stores and things of that magnitude. And what it boils down to is not what you think. It's not who you think is liable. It's who's actually on the paperwork that's held on the line that's actually liable. So always keep that in mind. Remember that. Government, I cannot stress this enough, governmental paperwork is vitally important, because whatever happens, they're going to reference your paperwork, what was submitted to the government, whose name was on the dotted line, who signed for it, who's the incorporator. So that's why whenever you're thinking about creating your organization, be mindful of a couple of things. Number one, the person that's the incorporator, do they have longevity in your organization? Do you foresee them being around for 4 to 5 years? Because nobody wants to have to constantly redo paperwork because folks are leaving the organization. So that's one thing you will think about. Number two, is this a person that can be liable for your organization? Is this somebody that you want doing business as, there's that word, DBA, doing business on behalf of your organization? Do you trust them to sign your organization's name at the bottom of a dotted line that's going to keep you liable for whatever they're signing for? So you want to keep these things in mind whenever you're doing paperwork or when you're putting people in positions on your boards in your organization. All right? So lastly, I want to go over intellectual property, because a lot of times we don't copyright things. We don't understand what copywriting means. We don't understand the importance of copywriting things. So I want to get into that a little bit in the last segment of this program. So intellectual property. Intellectual property is ownership of something intangible, and intangible means it's not touchable. So intangible such as an idea, a design, a concept or a formula. All right? Think about it like this. Whenever Bill Gates creates some new Microsoft program or some new program, he gets it copyrighted. Why does he get it copyrighted? Because what that says is anybody that uses or tries to mimic what I created, they have to pay me. In a nutshell, in essence, that's what it means. Composers, they copyright their music because anybody that uses their music, whether it be for a commercial, whether it be for a throwback, whether it be for a sampling to create new music, they have to get paid for it. So think about that. Whenever you write a book, you get it copyrighted so that nobody can take the concepts out of your book and get paid from it and you don't get paid. That's the importance of copywriting what you do. And so we're going to look at that really quickly. So a copyright, and you know I like to give the definition first. So a copyright is a work or authorship, and that's usually for literature when you write a book, a source code, when you write music. This is when you get things copyrighted. And again, that's for a work of authorship. So if you author something, whether it be composing music, writing a book, you get it copyrighted. Next, a trademark. A trademark is a sign or indicator associated with a brand. Of course, this goes for your logo.